dear Mr. Stone. So, good evening from Berlin. It's in the middle of the night here, and you are sitting in California. Is that right? Am I right?
I am in Los Angeles.
Los Angeles. So, how is Los Angeles at the moment? Is it hot and healthy and happy? As we like it, we Germans, we like to see California that way.
Yeah, I would say that's a good cliche, and it works.
Okay.
The weather is mild. It's not too cold. It's the beginning of late fall, and in the morning the skies are gray, but in the after they start to clear about now. It's about noon here, and the skies look. It's actually about 2 o'clock. The skies are really nice now. So it's a nice life. I mean, it's a life where you can disappear into a sort of hacienda style life. And on the other hand, that's not my style. I'm very active here. I find this a very conducive climate to work with very little interruption, not too much, because we have to travel certain distances to see people. It's not as busy as New York, where I used to live in New York, and it was always, I mean, in New York, you have to really, you have to make time to work, to concentrate, because there's so many demands on your time there. So it's easier here. I find life is a little easier for me to turn out things, and I've always been interested in producing things.
Fine. Then the reason that we two meet here in via Zoom is because you got an award, the B3 Ben Award, an honorary award. And I mean, this is not your first prize. Of course, you got so many prizes. You have 3 Oscars, but still you get prizes. What do they mean to you? What does it to you?
Well, generally speaking, they always raise my spirits.
Okay.
I mean, it's a tough profession, and it's filled with criticism and disappointment and financial. You never can satisfy the financial gods of this business. So, I mean, it's nice. A prize is a very uplifting thing, and especially if it comes from an organization such as yours, which I respect, and people who are interested in the arts, people who are interested in ideas. I guess some prizes are rather cynical, but I haven't gotten many of those. But I think the Oscars and all that, and it means a lot to my spirit. It raised me up, because if you read my book, Chasing the Light, I think you'd understand that there was a lot of rejection, and I'm used to rejection. I still am, and it's a tough road. So any help I can get from the cultural critics is good.
Okay, you just mentioned the financial aspects of making movies, and we had a crisis. We still have a crisis. We had this Corona crisis, and everything was shut down, locked down, the cinemas as well. And now there's one movie who should fix it all. It's James Bond. He has to get the people back into the cinemas. Did you see the movie yet?
No, I haven't. I think.
Okay.
That's a pretty silly idea. I mean, you shouldn't. Sabine, movie culture has lasted more than 100 years. I do think it's going to go on. It may not be the big business that they want it to be. I prefer to have a choice of films, and there's many other films that are coming out now. Very interesting films. I like the Bond series sometimes, but it's not my cultural determinant. And it's not the reason why the business is going to turn around. This weekend in China, a propagandistic war movie about the Korean War made more money than all the Bond series did in one weekend. So I mean, there's always, the movie business is always going to go on around the world. And as we become as the technology becomes faster and cheaper, there'll be more countries will be making their films.
And as you just mentioned it, your book, Chasing the Light, I had the impression when I read a lot of things about you, and that you might as well have become an author, not only a movie man, but an author. You started as an author when you were a child, I had the impression. You wrote little stories for your parents, for yourself, you earned money, and now the book. What does it mean to you?
The book is very important to me because there's been so much. I'm very proud of my movie career and my writing and for movies, but there's so much misunderstanding around what I've done and controversy that it's sometimes it's lost, it's blurred. And I think by writing my version of it, my version, not necessarily the truth, but my version, that I'm clearing my chest. The book only goes up the first 40 years from up to 1986 on the Platoon, but they're important years because it's the breakthrough and it was my first huge hit, international hit. Huge, and it made my career as a director and as a writer. So I'm very grateful to it. And it was the end of the first book because it was the achievement of a difficult dream with a lot of rejection. Now I'm going to write another book, and God willing, and it'll take a couple of more years, but I have a lot to say because a lot more happened right after Platoon. I made 20 feature films and about 9-10 documentaries. And I met, as you know, well, you know the rest of it. You know my story. More or less, you know my bibliography.
More or less, because this is such a huge story that would be too much to say that I know everything. But I read a lot, yes. So let's talk about your movies.
What did you think? May I ask you, what did you think of that first book, Child's Night Dream?
Pardon?
The first book was published in 1997 as Child's Night Dream, A Child's Night Dream.
Yes.
I don't know if you read it, but it was from St. Martin's Press. It was released in Germany too, I believe, and it was a strange book. It was written by it's a book by a 19-year-old author, me, and it's wild. I mean, experimental and crazy, and very much a 19-year-old's thoughts. And the thing is, I wrote it when I was 19. I preserved it, and when I went back to edit it and release it in 1996, I changed as little as possible. Even the embarrassing material, I didn't cut it out because I wanted to have the voice of a 19-year-old. So right now, in my novelistic career, or let's say writing career, I have a book when I was 19, and I have a book when I was older, this Child's Night Dream. This is an older view, and we crossed the same territory. So it's very interesting to see the years of your life examined from two different sides, from 19 years old and from 75 or 4 at that time.
And if you look back now, do you have the feeling that these are 2 lives or 3 lives, or that like cats have many lives? Do you think that, or do you think it's a flow?
I hope it's a flow for everybody because ideally your life should flow. I mean, it should make some sense. You work towards goals. Sometimes you achieve them, sometimes you don't, but there is a kind of a sense to it. So I think we all look for the sense of our lives. What's the meaning of this? So finally, let's say you're a guy who finds himself at the age of 60 in jail, let's say, like a lot of people do. How did I get here? What happened? Then you have to start to try to figure it out. I have avoided that for the time being, and I intend to finish my life, I hope, relatively peacefully. But you always wonder what it's about, what the meaning is, and you wonder how you're going to end. How does Act 3 work? So I'm in Act 3. No, this is interesting, and it challenges me, and that's one of the reasons I want to write the book, because I want to enjoy it while it's here, and not look back and say what happened.
Okay, I understand that. So now let's talk about my glasses. Well, if I don't have my glasses, I can see nothing. And let's talk about the movies now, because you are one of the greatest chroniclers. We all met. I think we all saw in the last years, in the last decades. How do you choose your topics? And I mean, all topics, even if it's a feature or if it's documentary. How do you choose that? What is the inspiration?
Well, there's no magic plan. There was no major plan. It was simply being yourself and developing. When I was, as you see from Chasing the Light, when I was 30 years old, I was broke and almost about to give up. my life turned around between 30 and 40, but I was basically the same person. But things changed, but I kept writing and writing and writing. I wrote 11, 12 screenplays and then treatments and all that. And finally, with Midnight Express, I got my first break. As all people get a break, it's always a bunch of accidents that happen. And in other words, my life has been guided by my experience. And I'm not an ideologue in the sense that I had a mission that I invented of my own. I always felt like I educated myself. I grew up, as you know, conservative. My father, very strong man, very educated man, but different views about American life. So I, of course, being the only child and a bit of a rebel, I went the other way, and I did not continue my education at Yale University, and I left. And I ended up in Vietnam twice as a civilian teacher, and then later as a military, as a soldier, an infantry soldier. So I've had, in other words, after my parents divorced, and that was a big event in my life. I discuss it in Child's Night Dream. No, I discuss it, I'm sorry, in both places. I discuss it also in Chasing the Light.
In your book, yes.
No. And in other words, I had to leave everything I knew behind, everything. America, all that competitive world of school. And I just went out on my own to Southeast Asia with a job in a teaching institution there for very little money. And then I went from there, from a teacher for two school terms, which was very interesting. I learned a lot. I went on to be a merchant sailor. And then eventually adventures all around Asia at that time, right before as the Vietnam War was starting. It was very interesting. And I ended up back in the United States. And then the events in the book go step by step on how I go back to the military because things are not working out for me in the United States, which becomes a source of creative. All my problems with my country, problems with my family become the source of your inspiration, as in any writer, or any writer does that. But that's the point is I had to leave the home and I had to start over. And
this is, sometimes I wonder, because this is so long ago and it still seems so important to you, so vivid, your parents, that they split, that they divorced. And I find this really, I think it's interesting. How does it come that it's still so deep in your mind? Is it such a deep experience?
Yeah, it's consciousness. You see, as the book says, I become more conscious as I get older. When these things happen, of course, you're affected, you're traumatized, but you don't really understand, and it doesn't make sense. You just live your life, and I think what we all look for is meaning. What is the meaning? What is the meaning of this divorce or this heartbreaking thing in my life? Everyone asks that question, and that's what writers address in their work. It becomes their life becomes their basis of what they write. And no matter what, even subjectively, small ways, but it always creeps in. So, in other words, my answer to your first question, which was, I developed, changed. So from the conservative to a more liberal point of view about everything. It took time coming out of the war, years. You learn slowly. The experience of war is not simple. I wasn't a knee-jerk reactionary to the war. I did not hate the war when I came back. I make my point that I was very confused, and the confusion, and then eventually you start to learn about life. By the time I was 30, I was starting to really understand better, but not at all. And one thing led to the other. I wrote Platoon partly to understand the war. I wrote Platoon to understand the war. And that was a big first step. And then I wrote Salvador too. Salvador was a second movie that I did in that time period. It was about an American Civil War in Central America. And America did not learn its lessons from Vietnam, and it seems to have continued. So I was upset, and as a veteran, I was addressing that situation. After that, And the tremendous success that that received, it was a validation that I was experimenting, thinking about these things, because they were making war movies in the United States that were pro-war, based, not pro-war, but jingoistic is the word, jingoistic, and I think militaristic. So I think I had to arrive at my own understanding.
So you want to understand things, and if you do a movie about a person, for example, Snowden, Putin, you want to look behind their facade. Is that true? Do you try to understand them? Is that possible?
That's much later.
Yeah.
That's, you know, in my life. Let's go back just to when being 40 years old and doing Platoon.
Okay.
The next movie I do was Wall Street, which is to deal with my father's world. Wall Street is where I grew up in New York City. He was at the heart of the business, you know. So understanding economics and which I wasn't ever very good at, but understanding how the economy worked and how the people functioned around it gave me insight, and I hung out on Wall Street. So Wall Street gave me a background, and then I moved on back to the Vietnam with Born on the 4th of July, but a bigger story about a young man who I knew, Ron Kovic, and he ended up in a wheelchair. And then I went out, and then from there, I mean, that was a very eye-opening picture for me, because I put myself in the shoes of another person, Ron. Empathy. I had empathy for him, and it came through in the movie, which was very successful. And then I went on to do a rock and roll film about a man who I thought was a poet, a visionary, Jim Morrison, The Doors. Yes. So one thing led to another. Each time I grew. And from there, of course, the JFK case is talk about a lie. I mean, it was a huge story, and I learned a lot about the American power system and what power is, how people fight for it, like dogs like dogs with a bone in the dust. I mean, that was a heavy story, and I went into it not like with an agenda. I went in like saying, you know, the more you read about this case, the weaker it is, the stranger it is, and that's what interested me. I saw it at that time, I saw it as a thriller, as a political thriller. And Jim Garrison's story was very tense. So I grew and I grew and I grew, and of course I get attacked, and you learn from the failures, and you learn from the pain. Everything I did after that was under a microscope, everything. So by the time, you know, you're talking Snowden is 2016.
16, yeah.
Much later in my life. I'm going from 1990. I'm still back in 1991 too. You're jumping ahead, but a lot of things happen. By the time I get to Documentaries in 2001, I saw the limitations of feature films for me. I saw the criticism. I saw that there was an agenda. Politics was off the table in the United States, especially after 2001. We became more militaristic as a country, more jingoistic, and the military films were increasingly strident and unbelievable to me. And but it was not possible to make those kind of movies anymore for me, because they knew I was critical of the structure of. I did not believe in the Iraq wars or any of the wars, Afghanistan. I thought we behaved poorly after 2001, so that became a new problem for me. So that's why I started to do documentary. Castro, not because I saw Castro as an amazing survivor, a man who fought the empire so close. He had an upfront point of view from his small island. It's amazing that he survived, as well as basically stood as a symbol for the rest of Latin America, as well as the world, of a man who could actually be independent of the United States. That was a big deal. Now, you may not agree with his policies, but for Christ's sake, he has the right to be, Cuba has the right to be what it wants to be. And the United States was not accepting that at the time. So it was I thought, a wonderfully true David and Goliath story. That's how I'm trying to explain to you how I get into these things. It's not like they lead me to it. And then it becomes, later on, it becomes Chavez, Hugo Chavez, and also Arafat. I went to see Arafat. And Chavez was great. I mean, he opened up a whole world to me. But and then later on, I did Untold History of the United States, which was my 12-hour epic history of the United States, which with a historian, Peter Kuznick, which I think is a kind of history we're not learning in school. I think it really is important. And I'm very proud of that work. That was in 2012 that came out.
Is that the teacher in you who wants to do that, who wants to explain these things?
It's a teacher, but also I think as a movie, it's a great movie. I think it's fast, it's exciting, and if you're interested in history, I think it's a kind of documentaries we don't make in America. We can't get them made. I was very lucky because by that time I was being financed by some international entities who were independent of the United States, but I could never have gotten that made by Netflix or HBO. They passed. They passed because it was critical of the United States, for Christ's sake, and it should be. It went from 1890, the imperialism of the 1890s, to up to 2012, the Obama regime.
So let's go back, please, just for a moment to Wall Street, to the movie Wall Street, because you dedicated this film to your father. And did you dedicate a film to your mother too?
Not that one. I dedicated Heaven and Earth to my mother. Heaven and Earth is the story of a Vietnamese woman peasant.
Okay. And what influence did your parents have on you on your filmmaking? Did you see them? Did you hear them when you thought about new topics or themes or ideas? Did you have them in mind?
Well, your parents are always a huge influence on everything you do, but let's say my father's points of view are in Wall Street. There is a character played by Hal Holbrook who was a stand-in for my father in a way. And my father's views of Wall Street were, of course, in a sense, violated by the new spirit of Wall Street. 1980s Wall Street was another ballgame, was more of a casino. And these new players were not people he would have approved of. So that, I mean, it was, but I liked Wall Street as the mood, the atmosphere. I enjoyed making that movie. I also made another one, a sequel to it in 2010 called Wall Street Money Never Sleeps, which is also a continuation of that story.
Yes. And if we stay chronological, can you tell me something about Natural Born Killers? Because I saw it then it was in the 90s, yes, 1994. And it was very, very brutal. How was it to do this film?
That was a watershed film for me. It made more, it was as controversial in its way as JFK. Or its violence but it was done in the spirit of disgust that I was fed up in the mid 1990s. This is 1993-4. It was actually out in 94. American media was changing radically and becoming more and more exhibitionist, sensationalist, much more so. And murder and all the domestic abuses became the television answer to the news. It became more important than the news. By the time the O.J. Simpson murder trial happened, it was all over. It absorbed all the news in the United States for almost a year. And it was ridiculous. It's a murder, but the concept of feeding off this, let's say, it becomes non-productive after a while if you keep talking about a murder or a trial. The obsession with violence was not healthy. And that's what I was trying to say in Natural Born Killers. Look at you. This is what we've become. A nation of fools, but a chain of fools, where we can't see the difference between reality and fantasy. In fact, we're still moving in that same direction in our foreign policy too, and in our way of fantasizing the world in the movies itself. We have become enamored of violence in America. We have so much of it that it's ingrained in us. We don't even see it. We don't understand what the difference between us and, let's say, a child raised in Europe might be. It's a different way of thinking, and too often in our country, aggression, violence is used as an answer. As I said, in our foreign policy, extremely so. Natural Born Killers is a protest movie done against the media, essentially, the media for sensationalizing the violence. And the institutions that allow it, the institutions, prison, and in the first part, police force, that create a violent atmosphere. The killers were, the two killers in the movie, Michael and Marie, a lot of young people liked, were bad people. Yes, they killed people. They killed a lot of people. But in the movie's framework, the other people are worse than they are.
I think it's really interesting how you can, how you can identify with them, with killers, because you have sympathy for them.
If you know why? Because they love each other, because that they have some positive qualities, and they have tremendous love for each other. Although it's fantasy, the movie is fantasy, is ridiculous. It's not realistic. I've done maybe 7, 8 movies realistic about violence, but this one was not. The violence in it was cartoonish and on purpose, but people couldn't see the difference, and I got a lot of heat for that.
But you really love to make movies about real persons, real stories.
Also,
bitte? Pardon?
Also,
yes. So many people would like to know why you switched then from making Hollywood movies, pictures, to documentaries. I think I have the impression that there are really documentary parts in some of your movies. So it's not just such a big cut.
No, I think I don't see the difference. I mean, it's a movie. A documentary is an enormous amount of work. It's not as difficult to do as a feature film, because you have to cast every part. So in documentary, I find a way to go for the truth of that situation. And sometimes in a feature film, it's too complicated. You can't do it. Untold History of the United States, you can't do as a feature film. And an interview with Castro or Chavez and the presidents of Latin America, it's not a feature film, but it's important subject matter, because at that time, Latin America was changing with a Bolivarian tide of revolution, revolting against the empire. It was a very serious revolt in 2007 through about 12, 13, 14, until Chavez was died. But it was a very important movement, and for liberation, somewhat like my Salvador movie, which I'd done in '85. I followed the trends of the time, and I felt like the world was desperately in need. What happened was the American empire became bigger and bigger and bigger. I never dreamed this would happen. I thought after Platoon in Vietnam that we would be moving into a more sensible direction, but we only got worse with the Bushes, the two Bushes. They put us in Iraq, the Iraq War, then the Afghanistan War, the overreaction of 2001, the fear of terrorism. At the same time, they called it a war on terror. Well, it's actually a war of terror. It's become a war of terror, and they killed far more people than were ever killed on 9/11. I mean, it's so insane and so out of proportion that this is a time when filmmakers should have spoken up and tried to do something, but too many of them didn't. And they ended up making, commercial jingoistic movies about how bad the terrorists were and how the intelligence agencies and so forth can solve this, and not military solutions, none of which is true. So there's been the distortion between reality and fantasy has gotten wider in America, in my opinion. And that comes it comes out in Natural Born Killers. You asked about that. In the mid-90s, I saw that. I felt I was right, but of course no one agrees. And I was fighting against the grain. And my movies, I've had failures too, but certainly it became harder for me to do the kind of movies I wanted to do with the freedom I wanted to do them with. And I loved Alexander, but it was badly handled. Some of them are my mistakes, but also the distribution of it was very bizarre. Anyway, it became, after that, you know, it was harder to work in this town, and I never prostituted myself. I never did a movie for money ever, but I always tried to keep my own sovereignty, my independence. And I did World Trade Center, which was I think a beautiful movie about a true story about what happened that day in the Trade Center. And then I did, as you know, W, about George W. Bush, the son, and it was a satire like Natural Born Killers. And then I did Wall Street and Savages, and then Snowden. Snowden is more like, again, all these revelations came out at that time, you know, the Snowden revelations, and as well as Assange. And a very important case, but it was ignored in America by the Americans. I think the Europeans, you know, Snowden was financed by Germany and by France. I don't know if you know that, but it's an important distinction to make, very important. But why wouldn't America finance a film about an American hero? Why? I couldn't understand that. So in other words, what I'm saying is the American view of the world and the reality of the world, in my opinion, increased, and it grew more and more distorted.
Now I would like to know how you handle criticism, good and bad criticism for your movies. How do you handle that?
Well, any filmmaker who tells you he doesn't care about what people say is not really telling the whole truth. I think all of us are sensitive, and we get hurt like everybody else when people criticize us, sometimes fairly and sometimes unfairly. It's very tough to be a public artist in the sense of a filmmaker who's making subjects that are current and sometimes controversial. And I think sometimes I get judged for the ideas I have rather than the movie I'm making. In other words, you should see the movie as I try to do. You try to see a movie and you don't have any preconceptions. But if you take a position like, let's say that John Kennedy was killed by more than one man, and in a government conspiracy, that's not going to go down with a lot of people who have preset ideas that their government did not do that. So in other words, your ideas can run up against the conception, popular conception, and you get criticized for that. That's not a real criticism, because truly it should be judged as a movie. As a movie, did it work for you or not? And
Yeah.
that's my criterion. It's always been my criterion, and I've gotten burned as a result quite a few times. It has nothing to do with my filmmaking ability, and sometimes that, by the way, is never mentioned. Some of the effects you put in the movies, it's ignored. The music, the actors, the editing, the writing, it's ignored in favor of points of view. So often it's just very subjective. Critics can be very subjective, and they're dealing with their own world and what they think and see. That's always a limitation. It's always a limitation. The best critics for me are the warmest, are the ones that are more universal and that support the questioning aspect, the investigative aspect of filmmaking. I love that. And I think I miss some of those critics, because some of them are older when I was growing up, and they were very helpful to me, like Roger Ebert and Stanley Kaufman in America, and in Europe too. I've had a few friends, but they were especially nice. But there's a whole new wave of critics that I guess I'm not in touch with, but it's very partisan. It's kind of like feminism, gender specifications. It's in favor of advocacy. It's not what I'm not used to it. And my biggest political issue has always been, from the beginning, I see it now, I didn't see it then, was war and peace, and how these societies can fit into that conception of having a benevolent universe, having a United Nations of a universe. That's always been my desire since I've grown up as a man. I would like to see, I pushed for that, and in my documentaries too. I'm making a new documentary about energy, clean energy, which is very important for the next 3 decades. Really important, actually, for the rest of our life. This century is going to be determined by our success in developing new energies and and harnessing the old ones. We have some very good solutions, but we haven't been able to implement them because of politics. And by that I mean, you know what I'm talking about. In Europe,
Yes.
France and Sweden have been smart and have gotten ahead of the energy revolution, primarily through use of nuclear energy. And Germany, on the other hand, started in that direction, and so shockingly to me, pulled away from it because of political pressure. I think the Green Party became very popular with their environmental issues. Environmentalism is very important, and I'm all for it, but it has to include nuclear, which is clean energy, and it's basically a renewable energy. It's very cheap energy.
So climate.
It's very destructive what they've done. They've only replaced it with more coal and CO2. So Europe is, I mean, I can't believe that the Germans did that, but they did it.
So climate change is the new topic that you're working on.
It should be everybody's topic. It's important. It's the most important one. And I've been working on this documentary now for almost 2 years with scientists Joshua Goldstein and Stefan Svist, who's a Swedish scientist. They have grown up they're very wise about, Sweden has a very interesting society, and France too. They have very clean energy, and it's a shame that we haven't learned from them, because they converted in a mass way away from coal and to nuclear, and of course and gas and oil too.
You just mentioned Germany and our new way of making politics. We are desperately seeking for a new chancellor. What is your view on Germany right now at this moment? Do you think you can deal with this with a good European partner still?
Listen, my desire is not necessarily the desire of the American government. The American government is only thinking politically. They're looking for stable Europe with a stable Germany that they can dominate. And by that, I mean the United States dominates NATO, and it's all a NATO arrangement. And above all, they're concerned with Russia and with China. And they hate the idea that Russia is selling natural gas to the Germans, among other things. So it's all very orthodox political warfare, uninteresting to me, but it's the way it has to be. If we could move beyond this point of view and say that, look, we have a climate problem for the whole universe here, not just America, not just Europe, but the world, the globe. And we're going down the tubes unless we get a control of our CO2. The only way to do this is in partnerships for peace. The leading, in my opinion, the leading fight against pollution is being, in terms of research, is being led by Russia, China, France, and the Swedens of the world. But even Sweden now has become more green and more scared of innovation. So what works sometimes for Western Europe does not work for the world. We have a problem with 4/5 of the world is hungry for more. They want food, but not only food, they're going to want energy. We're not answering that question. And this is crucial that we understand this, and this is what our documentary is about. So we're still living in a very localized, specific mentality that America versus China, America versus Russia, it doesn't do any good. It's unfortunately very retarded. So as you can see, I would like to have a progressive vision for all humanity. All the world would get off their, as they would say in the army, they take the broom out of their ass and start to think straight.
So who would you like to work with in the future? You just told me what the topics could be, climate change and energy, but which persons could it be?
Which one?
Which person would you like to do a movie about?
I'm working with scientists now. Obviously people who know what they're talking about. Not Hollywood people who talk about some cause like that for the week or not. It's not about those things. It's about intelligent scientific mind thinking about how do we deal with this and what are we going to do. but we're not there yet. Politics is constantly fighting with science.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Germany, at least Miss Merkel, who, was conservative, and she was, you can criticize her for many things, but at least she kept the dialogue open with the East. And I think for that, I'm grateful. But she speaks Russian, as you know, she knows Russia. And at least she stabilized the European balance when America was out of its mind with after Ukraine, America was going crazy, and we have to almost go to war against Russia. It was really nuts. I think she at least helped keep a balance. And Chirac too, by the way.
Yes.
You remember when Russia, France, and Germany refused to go to the Iraq War in 2003.
Mm-hmm.
It was a big moment. That was your chancellor was wonderful man. They don't like him in Germany, but he at least stayed out of war. What was his name?
Before Merkel, you mean?
Yes.
Kohl? Helmut Kohl or Gerhard Schröder?
Schroeder.
Okay.
Yeah, kept Germany out of that war.
Okay, I liked him. Yes. Never mind. Can you imagine to do a comedy, something completely different? Can you imagine that?
No, I couldn't do a comedy because I don't have that touch. Comedy is one of the hardest things to do, and yes. I have to say, no, it's not my strength. I mean, there is comedy in my films. If you look, there's a lot of funny stuff, but mm-hmm. I don't fish for it. I don't consider myself a comedian.
Okay, and do you like happy endings?
Very much. Yes.
Very much. Okay.
So a lot of people accuse me of being sentimental.
Being sentimental, okay. And filmmaking in the past and now and in the future. I mean, we have so many new ways to make films. Netflix and co is there. Is it an enrichment, or is it I'm losing my words. I'm so sorry. Or is it a competition, an enrichment or a competition? This new way of making films.
I think it remains to be seen. Certainly, I'm glad that films are being made, but I think the field got very limited. It came down to platforms like Netflix, HBO, and so forth, and in Germany too. But I think the future. I do miss the. You see, the problem with Netflix is that they have an audience, and they pre-program, and that's the way they do things. They, in other words, you might say if Oliver Stone comes up and his name comes up, they say, well, we put it on our graph and we put it out there, and the response is he's very controversial. Mm-hmm. Let's say that. So the 50% hate him, 50% love him. That's not true, but let's say it was. Mm-hmm. They say, well, we can't make that film because we lose half my audience before we start. That's not the right way to think about it. Every film should be its own film, and you develop it. And but you should not label something and then kill it off. In other words, in the old days, you came to a film studio. Maybe it can come back. You go to a film studio with a good idea. Let's make it. Mm-hmm. That was the best way to do a film. But now they think ahead all the time. It's like they have so many computer models that it gets confusing, and they make something that, oh, well, this is a chance of getting 75% rating with the audience, but far better than a 50% rating. So you don't make the film. And as a result, you lose the idea. Mm-hmm. Not good. Yes. I'd rather make ideas that are controversial or very important.
So what is your advice for young filmmakers who start to make
small? Start small, start personal, start small, starts personal, keep the budget low, like we all did when we went to film school. You make it at any price, you can do it. Mm-hmm. You make it with a tremendous willpower, make mm-hmm. it as good as you can, and you hope for the best. Mm-hmm. But it's never been easy for anybody in any generation, believe me.
And looking back at your career, what are your goals? Do you still feel pressure to?
The pressure I feel is from myself.
You don't feel the pressure to please.
To do good work is mm-hmm. the pressure I feel. I cannot go by the externals anymore because I'm old enough. I've had success and I've made enough money. So I'm not, it's a different goal now. The goal is to do good work, to get it out there. And that's why these documentaries to me are more important right now than any feature film subject. But I do have a plan to make maybe one or two more films. Now, I'm not going to tell you the subject matter because I want to keep it a secret, but I've been developing, and I might be back to make a feature film. And it will be without compromise. It'll be a feature film that has to be made because it should be made, like the Snowden film. I'm amazed still that the American financial side never came to that film's help, never helped that film.
Last question. If somebody would come to you and say, I would like to do a movie about you, what would you say?
Who's starring?
Who would you love to? Who would you love to be you?
I know, yeah. It depends on what year. I mean, what years do you want to talk about? You know? Of course, you want. No, I'm just joking. I no one's going to make a film about me. They don't even know who I am in America. But it's kind of you. It'd have to be financed by Germany and France, and in Italy.
It would be possible, I think.
No, thank you. No, it's never. I'm writing my books, and one day maybe if people will understand what motivated me.
Okay, let's hope for the best. Thank you so much, Mr. Stone.
Thank you very much, my dear.
Have a nice day, and
yes,
I hope to see something about you very, very soon in the cinema.
Good luck then. Good luck to you. Thank you, B3.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Anna.